on the night of June 21st, 1941, a Wehrmacht sergeant named Alfred Liskov did something that would alter the course of world history. He swam across the Bug River in the darkness of night, abandoning his unit, and surrendered himself to Soviet guards at the border. Breathless and desperate, he delivered a message that would shock the world. Tomorrow morning at 4 o'clock, Hitler will attack the Soviet Union with 3.8 million soldiers. But when this message reached Moscow, Stalin refused to believe it. Even more shocking, he ordered that Liskov be shot dead as an enemy agent. Less than 8 hours later, at 3:15 in the morning of June 22nd, 1941, the thunderous roar of thousands of German artillery pieces shattered the silence along a front stretching 2,900 kilometers. Operation Barbarossa, the largest and most devastating military offensive in human history, had begun. This is the story of the first 72 hours that not only changed the course of World War II, but determined the fate of civilization itself. This is a tale of two dictators, Hitler and Stalin, and the fatal decisions they made in the most critical moments of the 20th century. In these 72 hours, entire armies would be destroyed, cities would burn, and the delicate balance of world power would shift forever. Adolf Hitler stood at the precipice of his greatest gamble. By the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe. France had fallen in a stunning 6-week campaign. Britain stood alone, battered but not broken. The Battle of Britain had ended in German defeat, and the Luftwaffe lay bloodied. Any rational military leader would have consolidated gains, perhaps sought peace with Britain, or focused on the Mediterranean theatre. Instead, Hitler chose to shatter the non-aggression pact he had signed with Stalin just 2 years earlier, and open a second front against the largest country on earth. This decision would prove to be the beginning of his downfall. But in June 1941, Hitler believed he was about to complete his destiny as the master of Europe. The decision to invade the Soviet Union wasn't born of military necessity. It was ideological obsession mixed with fatal overconfidence. Hitler had convinced himself that the Soviet Union was a house of cards that would collapse with a single kick. In a meeting with his generals in July 1940, he declared, "Russia's destruction must therefore be made part of this struggle. The sooner Russia is crushed, the better." The genesis of Barbarossa. The planning for Operation Barbarossa began in earnest in December 1940, when Hitler issued Führer Directive 21, the formal order for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The directive was chillingly clear. The German armed forces must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign even before the conclusion of the war against England. The German High Command, led by General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, developed a strategy that called for a lightning campaign lasting no more than 4 months. The German military plan called for an advance to the so-called AA line, a hypothetical boundary running from the port of Archangel in northern Russia to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. Beyond this line, Hitler believed, lay only scattered resistance and vast empty territories that could be colonized by German settlers. But this wasn't merely about territory or even strategic advantage. Operation Barbarossa embodied Hitler's most sinister ambitions: the eradication of communism, the conquest of Lebensraum, living space for Germans, and the implementation of General Plan Ost, a genocidal blueprint calling for the mass deportation, enslavement, and extermination of Slavic peoples. According to this plan, 31 million Slavs were to be removed from Eastern Europe, with millions more reduced to slave labour. The military colossus, the force Hitler assembled for Barbarossa, dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. Over 3.8 million Axis troops prepared to invade along an 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The German army committed 148 divisions, representing 80% of its entire strength, to this single operation. Never before in history had such a massive military force been concentrated for a single campaign. 17 panzer divisions, organized into 4 panzer groups, formed the armored spearhead of the invasion. These mechanized units, proven in the conquest of Poland and France, were expected to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in massive cauldron battles. Supporting them were 3,350 tanks, ranging from the reliable Panzer III and IV to older models pressed into service for this monumental undertaking. The Luftwaffe committed nearly 2,770 aircraft to the operation, organized into 4 air fleets. Luftflotte 1 supported Army Group North's drive toward Leningrad. Luftflotte 2 backed Army Group Center's advance on Moscow, while Luftflotte 4 provided air cover for Army Group South's push into Ukraine. The Romanian Air Force added another 500 aircraft to the Axis total. Behind this massive assault force came the logistics tail: over 600,000 motor vehicles and 625,000 horses. The German army, despite its modern image, still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. For Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht requisitioned horses from across occupied Europe, creating one of the largest cavalry forces in military history, albeit one used primarily for logistics rather than combat. The three-pronged attack. The German plan divided the massive front into 3 primary axes of advance, each with specific objectives that Hitler believed would lead to Soviet collapse within months. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, consisted of 26 divisions, including 3 panzer divisions. Their mission was to advance through the Baltic states, capture Leningrad, and link up with Finnish forces fighting in the north. Leningrad, as the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union's second-largest city, held enormous symbolic importance. Hitler believed its capture would deliver a crushing psychological blow to Soviet resistance. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was the strongest of the 3 army groups with 51 divisions, including 9 panzer divisions organized into 2 powerful panzer groups. Their objective was the most direct route to Moscow, advancing through Minsk and Smolensk. This force was expected to destroy the bulk of the Red Army's Western forces in a series of encirclement battles before capturing the Soviet capital. Hitler and his generals believed that the fall of Moscow would effectively end Soviet resistance. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, comprised 57 divisions, including 5 panzer divisions. Their mission was to conquer Ukraine, the Soviet Union's breadbasket and industrial heartland. The capture of Ukraine would deprive the Soviets of crucial agricultural and industrial resources, while providing Germany with the food and raw materials necessary for its war effort, materials needed to sustain its war effort. Romanian and Hungarian forces would support this southern offensive. The plan appeared flawless on paper. German intelligence estimated Soviet strength at 200 divisions, but believed most were poorly equipped and trained. The recent purges of the Red Army Officer Corps, which had seen Stalin execute or imprison over 30,000 officers, including most of the senior leadership, seemed to confirm German assumptions about Soviet weakness. Fatal assumptions. However, the Barbarossa plan contained fatal flaws that would ultimately doom the entire enterprise. German intelligence seriously underestimated Soviet military strength and resilience. They assumed the Red Army would collapse after losing its border armies, but failed to account for the Soviet Union's ability to mobilize fresh reserves from its vast interior. The plan also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet geography and climate. German logistics experts calculated they could supply their forces for an advance of 300 miles beyond their railheads, but the distances in Russia were far greater than anything they had encountered in Western Europe. The primitive road network would turn into impassable mud with the autumn rains, and the Russian winter would arrive earlier and prove more brutal than anticipated. Perhaps most critically, the plan assumed a short campaign. German industry had not been mobilized for a prolonged war on the scale that would be required in Russia. Unlike the Soviet Union, which was already on a total war footing, Germany was still producing consumer goods and maintaining peacetime living standards for its civilian population. This would prove to be a decisive disadvantage as the war dragged on. The paranoid dictator. While Hitler prepared his war machine for the greatest invasion in history, Joseph Stalin sat in the Kremlin, willfully blind to the gathering storm. The Soviet leader's paranoia, which had served him well in his rise to power, now became his greatest weakness. Stalin had spent the previous 4 years systematically destroying the Red Army's leadership in the Great Purge, executing or imprisoning virtually every competent senior officer on charges of treason and conspiracy. By 1941, the Red Army was led by officers promoted far beyond their experience and capability. The average Soviet division commander had held his position for less than a year. The institutional knowledge built up over decades of military development had been wiped out in Stalin's quest to eliminate any potential threat to his rule. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the brilliant military theorist who had developed Soviet deep battle doctrine, had been shot as a German spy in 1937, along with 7 other marshals and thousands of other officers. Yet Stalin's paranoia extended beyond his own military. He was convinced that Britain was trying to drag the Soviet Union into war with Germany to save itself from German invasion. Every warning about German intentions was dismissed as British propaganda, designed to manipulate him into breaking his non-aggression pact with Hitler. This fatal misconception would cost millions of Soviet lives. Warnings ignored. The warnings came from everywhere, and Stalin ignored them all. British intelligence, based on ultra-intercepts of German communications, repeatedly warned the Soviets of the impending attack. Winston Churchill personally sent a message to Stalin in April 1941, stating that German forces were massing on the Soviet border. Stalin dismissed it as a British trick to involve the Soviet Union in war with Germany. Soviet intelligence agents throughout Europe reported massive German troop movements eastward. Richard Sorge, the master Soviet spy operating in Japan, sent detailed intelligence about the timing and scale of the planned German attack. His messages, based on information from sources within the German embassy in Tokyo, accurately predicted the invasion would begin in late June. Stalin not only ignored these warnings, but ordered Sorge to stop sending disinformation. German reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory increased dramatically in the weeks before the invasion, with over 300 violations of Soviet airspace recorded in the first 3 weeks of June alone. When Soviet commanders requested permission to shoot down these intruders, Stalin refused, fearing it might provoke the Germans. Some German reconnaissance pilots even made emergency landings on Soviet airfields, and were politely refueled and sent on their way. Most tellingly, German deserters and defectors increasingly brought word of the impending attack. Alfred Liskov was only the most famous of dozens of German soldiers who tried to warn the Soviets. Some were communist sympathizers, others were simply horrified by the crimes they knew would be committed. Without exception, Stalin ordered them all shot as provocateurs. The Red Army unprepared. The result of Stalin's willful blindness was a Red Army caught completely off guard. Along the entire western frontier, Soviet forces were positioned not for defense, but for the execution of offensive operations that existed only in Stalin's imagination. The dictator had convinced himself that if war came, it would be the Red Army that would strike first, carrying the revolution into Western Europe. Soviet forces were deployed in vulnerable forward positions, concentrated near airfields and supply depots that made perfect targets for German attack. The new fortifications of the Molotov Line, built along the borders established after the Soviet invasion of Poland and the Baltic states, were incomplete and poorly manned. Meanwhile, the older Stalin Line fortifications had been abandoned and stripped of their weapons. The Red Army's equipment situation was chaotic. The force was in the middle of a massive modernization program, with new tanks like the T-34 and KV-1 being produced alongside obsolete models left over from the 1930s. Many units had a mixture of old and new equipment that complicated training and maintenance. Spare parts were scarce, and much of the Air Force consisted of outdated aircraft, sitting in neat rows on forward airfields, perfect targets for the coming German air assault. Communication systems were primitive and unreliable. Many Soviet units lacked radio equipment and depended on telephone lines that would be easily cut by German artillery and air attacks. Command and control would quickly break down once the fighting began, leaving isolated units without orders or coordination. The Night of Denial. On the night of June 21st to 22nd, 1941, as German forces moved into their final positions, Stalin still clung to the delusion that war could be avoided. At 12:30 a.m., just hours before the invasion, Defense Minister Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of General Staff Georgy Zhukov arrived at Stalin's dacha with urgent reports of German preparations for attack. Border guards reported the sound of tank engines and the removal of German wire obstacles along the frontier. Stalin's response was to issue Directive Number 1, ordering Soviet forces to be ready to repulse a surprise attack, but specifically forbidding any action that might provoke the Germans. Soviet troops were not to occupy firing positions, aircraft were not to be dispersed, and under no circumstances were they to cross the border. The directive, sent out just hours before the German attack, ensured that Soviet forces would be caught in the most vulnerable possible position. When the first reports of German artillery fire reached Moscow at 3:30 a.m., Stalin initially refused to believe them. He was convinced this was either a provocation by rogue German commanders or a mistake that could be resolved diplomatically. It was not until 4 a.m., when reports of attacks along the entire front could no longer be denied, that Stalin finally accepted the reality of war. Even then, his first instinct was to minimize the crisis. He ordered a second directive sent to Soviet forces, still hoping to contain the conflict. Soviet commanders were authorized to attack German forces, but were specifically forbidden from crossing the German border or flying over German territory. Stalin apparently believed he could limit the scope of the war and perhaps negotiate a settlement. The collapse begins. The result of Stalin's fatal miscalculations became apparent within hours of the German attack. Across the entire front, Soviet forces were caught completely unprepared. Airfields were bombed while aircraft sat in neat rows, their pilots asleep in nearby barracks. Command posts were overrun before commanders fully understood what was happening. Entire armies began to disintegrate under the German onslaught. But perhaps most tragically, Stalin's purges had created a climate of fear that paralyzed the Soviet response. Officers who might have shown initiative were terrified of being shot for unauthorized actions. Many chose to wait for orders that never came, rather than risk being accused of exceeding their authority. The result was a military catastrophe, unprecedented in modern warfare. Stalin himself reportedly suffered something approaching a nervous breakdown in the first days of the invasion. For nearly a week, he retreated to his dacha and refused to see anyone, leaving the Soviet Union leaderless at its moment of greatest peril. Only the personal intervention of his remaining lieutenants brought him back to Moscow to lead the defense of his regime. 3:15 a.m., the thunder begins. At exactly 3:15 a.m. Moscow time on June 22nd, 1941, the world changed forever. Along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 7,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously in the largest artillery barrage in military history. The sound could be heard 150 kilometers away from the front lines. German forward observers, who had been infiltrating Soviet territory for days, called down precise fire on predetermined targets. Soviet command posts, ammunition dumps, fuel depots and communication centers disappeared in thunderous explosions. Border guards, many of whom were still asleep in their bunkers, were buried alive as their positions collapsed under the concentrated bombardment. Lieutenant Hans Rettiger of the 6th Panzer Division later wrote, "The entire horizon seemed to be on fire. The ground shook beneath our feet as if from an earthquake. We had to shout to be heard over the continuous roar of the guns. It was like watching the end of the world." This was the opening movement of what would become the most brutal conflict in human history, the Air War's first hours. Simultaneously with the artillery barrage, nearly 2,000 German aircraft swept across the border in carefully coordinated waves. The first targets were Soviet airfields, which intelligence had identified and mapped during months of reconnaissance flights. The Luftwaffe pilots found their targets exactly where expected, row upon row of Soviet aircraft parked in the open, as if displayed for destruction. At Grodno Airfield, just inside the Soviet border, Major Hannes Trautloft of JG-54 led the first Luftwaffe strike. His Messerschmitt Bf-109s arrived at 3:25 a.m. to find 40 Soviet aircraft perfectly lined up on the runway. Within minutes, every Soviet plane was destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The attack was so sudden that Soviet pilots didn't even reach their aircraft. The pattern repeated across the entire front. At Brest-Litovsk, 34 Soviet bombers were destroyed on the ground. At Białystok, an entire regiment of fighter aircraft was wiped out before a single Soviet pilot could take off. By noon on June 22nd, the Luftwaffe claimed to have destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, with fewer than 40 German planes lost. Soviet pilot Ivan Kozyadub, who would later become the highest-scoring Soviet ace, was at flight school when the war began. He recalled, "We heard explosions and saw smoke rising from our airfield. When we reached the flight line, we found our training aircraft in flames. It was only then that we learned we were at war. Everything we had trained for was gone in the first hour." Fortress Brest-Litovsk, symbol of resistance. While most Soviet positions crumbled under the initial German assault, one fortress would become a symbol of desperate resistance. The Brest Fortress, built by the Russians in the 19th century and modernized by the Poles in the 1930s, sat directly in the path of German Army Group Center's advance. The fortress housed elements of 4 different Soviet regiments, totaling about 9,000 men, along with families of officers and civilian workers, perhaps 15,000 people in total. At 3:15 a.m., German artillery concentrated massive firepower on this single target. The 45th Infantry Division, supported by siege artillery, had been specifically assigned to reduce the fortress quickly and continue the advance. But the fortress held. Despite devastating bombardment that collapsed buildings and killed hundreds in the first hour, the surviving Soviet defenders organized a desperate defense. Major Pyotr Gavrilov of the 44th Rifle Regiment and Commissar Efim Fomin rallied the survivors, setting up defensive positions in the ruins and organizing counterattacks against German assault troops. The German 45th Division found itself locked in brutal close-quarters combat in the rubble of the fortress. Every room had to be cleared with grenades and submachine guns. Soviet defenders fought from cellars, sewers, and collapsed bunkers, appearing suddenly to attack German positions before vanishing back into the ruins. What was supposed to be a brief delaying action turned into a week-long siege that tied down an entire German division. The defenders held out until June 29th, with isolated groups continuing to resist even longer. The last known defender, Major Gavrilov, was captured on July 23rd, more than a month after the invasion began. German officers, veteran of campaigns in Poland and France, were stunned by the ferocity of the defence, the panzer breakthrough. While the infantry battled for the fortress, German armoured spearheads were already racing deep into Soviet territory. The four panzer groups, massive concentrations of tanks, motorised infantry and mobile artillery, punched through Soviet defensive positions that had been shattered by the opening bombardment. Panzer Group 2, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, achieved a breakthrough south of Brest-Litovsk within hours of the attack beginning. Guderian, the father of German blitzkrieg tactics, personally led his tanks across the Bug River on a bridge that Soviet engineers had failed to destroy. By evening of the first day, his lead elements were 60 kilometers inside Soviet territory. In the north, Panzer Group 4 under General Erich Heppner smashed through Soviet positions near Šiauliai and raced toward the Dvina River. Soviet resistance was sporadic and uncoordinated. Entire Soviet divisions simply dissolved as German armour bypassed their positions and struck at their supply lines and headquarters. The speed of the German advance was unprecedented. Tank crews, veterans of the French campaign, were amazed by the distances they covered. Sergeant Hans Becker of the 7th Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "We have been driving for 18 hours straight. The Russians seem to have no idea where we are. We pass abandoned positions, destroyed aircraft, fleeing columns. It is like driving through a defeated army." Soviet command collapse. The German strategy of targeting Soviet command and communication systems in the opening hours proved devastatingly effective. Within minutes of the attack beginning, most Soviet frontier armies had lost contact with their divisions, and division commanders had lost contact with their regiments. The Western Front, commanded by General Dmitry Pavlov, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force within 12 hours of the German attack. Pavlov, appointed to his position just 6 months earlier, found himself commanding formations that no longer responded to orders. His communication systems had been destroyed, his air force wiped out, and his armoured reserves were moving blind into German traps. At 9:15 a.m., Marshal Timoshenko issued Directive Number 2, ordering Soviet forces to launch immediate counterattacks to destroy German forces that had crossed the border. The directive assumed that Soviet forces remained intact and capable of coordinated offensive action. In reality, most units that received the order were already surrounded or destroyed. General Ivan Boldin, deputy commander of the Western Front, spent the first day of war trying to reach his headquarters at Minsk, only to discover that German paratroopers had captured the city's airfield and panzer spearheads were approaching from the south. The entire structure of Soviet command and control had collapsed in less than 24 hours. The human cost begins. Behind the dramatic movements of armies and the tactical brilliance of German operations lay a human tragedy of enormous proportions. The German attack was not merely a military operation, but the beginning of a genocidal war aimed at the destruction of entire populations. Following closely behind the Wehrmacht came the Einsatzgruppen, special SS units tasked with the mass murder of Jews, communist officials, and Soviet intellectuals. Within days of the invasion, these units began systematic massacres that would eventually claim over 1 million lives. The rules of war, tenuous as they were, had been abandoned entirely. Soviet prisoners, when they were taken at all, faced starvation, disease, and execution. German planners had made no provision for feeding or housing the massive numbers of prisoners they expected to capture. Prisoner of war camps were little more than open fields surrounded by barbed wire, where captured Soviet soldiers died by the thousands from hunger and exposure. Civilian populations faced terror bombing, summary execution, and forced deportation. German aircraft strafed refugee columns fleeing the advancing armies. Artillery deliberately targeted hospitals, schools, and residential areas. The Wehrmacht's own records document the systematic destruction of Soviet civilian infrastructure, a violation of international law that German commanders justified as military necessity. The die is cast. By midnight on June 22, 1941, just 21 hours after the invasion began, it was clear that the world had entered a new and terrible phase of warfare. German forces had advanced up to 80 kilometers in some sectors, destroyed over 1,000 Soviet aircraft, and surrounded hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. But the very success of the German attack contained the seeds of future disaster. The enormous front, the vast distances, the primitive road network, all the factors that German planners had dismissed or underestimated, were already beginning to strain the Wehrmacht's resources. Supply lines were stretching, mechanical breakdowns were increasing, and the first signs of Soviet resistance were appearing. More ominously, the German leadership had fatally underestimated their enemy's capacity for resistance and regeneration. While border armies collapsed, the vast Soviet interior was already mobilizing reserves. Factory workers were being formed into militia units, industrial plants were being evacuated eastward, and Stalin's regime, though shaken, was beginning to organize for total war. The first 24 hours of Operation Barbarossa had been a German triumph, but they had also set in motion forces that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich and reshape the entire world. The die had been cast, and there would be no turning back from the abyss that now opened before all the peoples of Eastern Europe. Dawn brings destruction. As the sun rose on June 22, 1941, across the vast expanse of Eastern Europe, the true scale of the catastrophe befalling the Soviet Union became apparent. German reconnaissance aircraft, flying unchallenged through Soviet airspace, sent back reports that exceeded even the most optimistic German expectations. Entire Soviet armies were in full retreat, airfields lay in ruins, and major cities were already threatened by advancing German spearheads. The speed of collapse was staggering. The Soviet Fourth Army, positioned to defend the approaches to Minsk, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its commander, General Alexander Korobkov, had lost contact with most of his divisions by 6 a.m. and would be executed by Stalin within days for his cowardice and treachery. The reality was that no commander could have prevented the disaster that overtook his forces in those first critical hours. At Kaunas, capital of recently annexed Lithuania, German paratroopers seized key bridges before Lithuanian defenders even knew war had begun. By 7 a.m., advance elements of Panzer Group 4 were crossing the Nemunas River, having covered nearly 50 kilometers in less than 4 hours. The entire Baltic region lay open to German conquest. The massacre of the Soviet Air Force, the destruction of Soviet air power on the first day of Barbarossa, remains one of the most complete military disasters in aviation history. By noon on June 22nd, the Luftwaffe claimed the destruction of 1,489 Soviet aircraft, with only 35 German planes lost. Most Soviet aircraft never got off the ground. The reasons for this catastrophe went far beyond German tactical superiority. Stalin's purges had decimated the Soviet Air Force leadership, and the remaining commanders were terrified of taking any initiative without explicit orders. When German attacks began, many Soviet pilots were ordered to wait for further instructions, rather than scramble to defend their airfields. Colonel Ivan Kopets, commander of the Western Front's Air Force, watched helplessly as his aircraft were destroyed on the ground. By evening, of his original strength of 1,789 aircraft, fewer than 200 remained operational. Faced with Stalin's certain wrath, Kopets shot himself in his office. The first of many Soviet commanders who would choose suicide rather than face the dictator's justice. The psychological impact on surviving Soviet aircrew was devastating. Senior Lieutenant Stepan Suprin, one of the few Soviet pilots to achieve success on the first day by shooting down a German bomber, later wrote, "We trained for years to defend our homeland, only to watch our comrades die on the ground before they could even start their engines. The Germans had achieved in one day what we thought impossible. They had eliminated our air force as a fighting force. Guderian's race to glory. General Heinz Guderian, commanding Panzer Group 2 on the southern flank of Army Group Center, emerged as the star of the opening day. A veteran of the French campaign and pioneer of armoured warfare, Guderian understood better than anyone how to exploit the chaos created by the initial attack. His tanks, led by the 18th Panzer Division, crossed the Bug River at multiple points before Soviet defenders could organise resistance. By midday, German armour was advancing on 3 separate axes towards Slonim, Baranovichi and Minsk. Soviet attempts at counterattack were brushed aside by combined arms tactics that the Red Army had no answer for. Guderian personally accompanied his lead elements, establishing his command post just behind the advancing spearheads. When concerned staff officers suggested he was taking unnecessary risks, Guderian replied, "The place for a panzer commander is with his tanks, not in some bunker 50 kilometers to the rear." This aggressive leadership style inspired his subordinates and maintained the momentum of advance that was crucial to blitzkrieg success. By nightfall on June 22nd, Guderian's forces had penetrated nearly 80 kilometers into Soviet territory and were approaching Slonim. Soviet resistance was crumbling, with entire regiments abandoning their positions and fleeing eastward. The roads were clogged with retreating Soviet troops, civilian refugees and abandoned equipment, all perfect targets for German aircraft. The encirclement begins. German success in the first 24 hours set the stage for the massive encirclement battles that would characterize the opening phase of Barbarossa. Army Group Center's 2 panzer groups, advancing on divergent axes, aimed to link up east of Minsk and trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in a giant cauldron. The concept of the cauldron battle, or Kesselschlacht, had been perfected during the French campaign. Fast-moving armour would punch through enemy lines, advance rapidly to encircle large formations, then hold the ring while slower-moving infantry destroyed the trapped forces. Applied to the vast spaces of Russia, this tactic promised to destroy the entire Red Army in the border regions. Soviet commanders, trained in outdated tactics that emphasized linear defense, had no answer to this new form of warfare. When German armor appeared in their rear areas, cutting supply lines and communications, most units simply disintegrated. The rigid Soviet command structure, weakened by the purges and terrorized by Stalin's regime, could not adapt quickly enough to counter German mobility. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Front, issued increasingly desperate orders for counterattacks that his shattered forces could not execute. His mechanized corps, equipped with modern T-34 and KV-1 tanks that were superior to German armor, were fed piecemeal into battle and destroyed by superior German tactics and air support. Behind enemy lines. The rapid German advance created chaos in Soviet rear areas that compounded the military disaster. Communication systems collapsed as German forces overran command posts and cut telephone lines. Supply convoys found themselves behind German lines, and ammunition dumps were abandoned or destroyed to prevent their capture. Soviet military airports, many located well behind the front lines, became death traps as German aircraft appeared, without warning, to strafe and bomb grounded planes. Pilots who had survived the initial attacks found themselves cut off from fuel and spare parts, unable to maintain their remaining aircraft. The civilian population was caught completely unprepared for war. Despite months of German military build-up visible from the Soviet side of the border, Stalin's government had told the people nothing about the possibility of attack. When German bombs began falling on Soviet cities, Many citizens initially thought it was an air defense exercise. In the recently annexed territories of eastern Poland and the Baltic states, German forces encountered populations with complex loyalties. Some ethnic minorities, brutalized by Soviet occupation, initially welcomed the Germans as liberators. This would prove to be a tragic miscalculation, as Nazi racial policies would soon make clear that all Slavic peoples were marked for destruction or enslavement. Stalin's iron grip weakens. The scale of the disaster unfolding along the western frontier began to reach Stalin in the Kremlin through fragmentary reports that painted an increasingly dire picture. By evening on June 22nd, it was clear that the initial Soviet response had failed completely, and that German forces were advancing virtually unopposed in many sectors. Stalin's first reaction was characteristic. He sought someone to blame for the catastrophe rather than addressing its causes. General Pavlov was recalled to Moscow within days and executed, along with his chief of staff and communications chief, for cowardice and treachery. Similar fates awaited other commanders who had the misfortune to be in positions of responsibility when the attack began. But for perhaps the first time in his career, Stalin found himself facing a crisis that could not be resolved by terror and execution. The German invasion was a reality that no amount of paranoid rage could change. Reports continued to arrive of entire armies destroyed, cities captured, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops killed or captured. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who had negotiated the non-aggression pact with Germany, was tasked with announcing the invasion to the Soviet people. His radio address, broadcast at noon on June 22nd, was the first official confirmation that the Soviet Union was at war. Notably, it was Molotov, not Stalin, who spoke to the nation. The dictator was apparently too shaken by events to appear in public. The first prisoners. By the end of the first day, German forces had captured thousands of Soviet prisoners, a number that would grow to millions in the coming weeks. These early prisoners provided German intelligence with their first detailed look at Soviet military capabilities and morale. What they found was sobering. While Soviet equipment was often excellent, the T-34 tank would prove superior to anything in the German arsenal. Training was poor, and leadership was weak. Many Soviet soldiers had never fired their weapons in training, and junior officers were terrified of making decisions without authorization from above. German interrogators were struck by the political indoctrination of Soviet troops, who seemed genuinely surprised that German workers had not risen in revolution against their capitalist oppressors. Many expressed confusion about why they were fighting Germans at all, having been told for 2 years that Germany was a friendly nation. However, the German treatment of Soviet prisoners would soon eliminate any possibility of political exploitation. Nazi ideology classified Slavs as subhuman, and Soviet prisoners of war were denied the protection of international law. Within days, mass executions of commissars and Jewish prisoners had begun, setting a pattern of atrocity that would characterize the entire Eastern Front. Technology meets reality. The first day of Barbarossa also revealed important technical lessons that would influence the course of the campaign. German tanks, designed for the roads of Western Europe, began to show mechanical problems on the primitive tracks of Eastern Europe. The panzer forces reported higher than expected breakdown rates, especially among the older Panzer I and II models that made up a significant portion of German strength. Soviet resistance, while initially ineffective, demonstrated technological capabilities that surprised German commanders. The few T-34 tanks that engaged German armour proved nearly invulnerable to standard German anti-tank weapons. The massive KV-1 heavy tank was even more formidable, with armour that could stop anything the Germans could fire at it. German infantry encountered Soviet artillery that was both more numerous and more effective than intelligence had predicted. The Katyusha rocket launcher, first used in combat during the opening battles, created psychological terror among German troops with its distinctive howling sound and devastating explosive power. The long night. As darkness fell on June 22, 1941, German forces consolidated their gains and prepared for the next phase of operations. In 21 hours of fighting, Army Group Centre had advanced up to 80 kilometres. Army Group North had secured bridgeheads across major rivers, and Army Group South had begun its drive into Ukraine. The statistics were staggering. Over 1,000 Soviet aircraft destroyed, hundreds of tanks captured or destroyed, and tens of thousands of prisoners taken. Entire Soviet divisions had simply vanished from German intelligence maps. It appeared that the Red Army was on the verge of complete collapse. But even in victory, some German commanders noted ominous signs. The distances were greater than anything they had encountered before. Supply lines were already stretching thin, and Soviet resistance, while ineffective, showed a desperate determination that had been absent in Western Europe. Most concerning was the sheer size of the Soviet Union. Even the most successful advance barely dented the vastness of Russian territory. As German soldiers settled down for their first night on Soviet soil, many wrote letters home describing their easy victory. Few realized they had just taken the first steps into a conflict that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich and claim over 27 million lives. The first day of Operation Barbarossa was ending, but the real test of German ambitions was just beginning. June 23rd. No rest for the Wehrmacht. Dawn on June 23rd, 1941, brought no respite for the shattered Soviet forces along the western frontier. If anything, the second day of Operation Barbarossa would prove even more devastating than the first. German commanders, euphoric over their initial success, pushed their forces forward with renewed vigour, determined to complete the destruction of Soviet resistance before it could reorganise. The weather remained perfect for mobile operations, clear skies that allowed the Luftwaffe to operate at maximum efficiency, and dry ground that permitted tanks to advance cross-country at high speed. German meteorologists predicted the good weather would continue for weeks, a forecast that would prove tragically optimistic. General Franz Holder, chief of the German Army General Staff, wrote in his diary, "The enemy was tactically surprised along the entire front. All bridges across the Bug and other rivers were in our hands undamaged. The entire leadership is disrupted. The enemy is reacting hesitantly and without unity." The German High Command was already beginning to plan for the post-war occupation of Soviet territory. The race to Minsk. The prize that beckoned most tantalizingly to German forces was Minsk, the capital of Belarus and the key to the entire central sector. The city lay at the intersection of major road and rail networks, making it essential for German supply lines. More importantly, its capture would trap huge numbers of Soviet troops in the developing encirclement. Guderian's Panzer Group II, advancing from the south, made spectacular progress on the second day. His lead elements covered another 60 kilometres, brushing aside desperate Soviet counterattacks and racing through countryside, littered with abandoned equipment. Soviet attempts to establish defensive lines were frustrated by the speed of German advance and the complete absence of air cover. From the north, General Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group III was making equally impressive progress. His 7th Panzer Division, commanded by General Hans Freiherr von Funk, had covered over 100 kilometres in 36 hours and was approaching Vilnius. The two panzer groups were converging on Minsk like the jaws of a massive trap. Soviet General Ivan Boldin, deputy commander of the Western Front, was desperately trying to organise some form of coherent resistance. With most communications severed and his superior General Pavlov effectively out of contact, Boldin found himself commanding fragments of divisions scattered across hundreds of square kilometres. His attempts to coordinate counterattacks were frustrated by lack of information and the rapid pace of German advance. Luftwaffe supremacy. The German Air Force continued its devastating assault on Soviet air power on the second day, claiming another 500 aircraft destroyed. More importantly, the Luftwaffe began to shift its focus from airfields to direct support of ground forces, providing the close air support that made German blitzkrieg tactics so effective. Stuka dive bombers, flying in formations of 30 or more aircraft, decimated Soviet troop concentrations and supply columns. The psychological effect of their screaming sirens was almost as important as their explosive payload. Soviet soldiers, with no air cover and minimal anti-aircraft protection, were terrorized by attacks they could neither prevent nor counter. German fighter aircraft roamed freely over Soviet territory, strafing trains, supply convoys, and retreating columns. The few remaining Soviet fighters that managed to take off were overwhelmed by experienced German pilots flying superior aircraft. The Luftwaffe was achieving something unprecedented in modern warfare: complete air supremacy over an area covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. The human tide. What German commanders had not anticipated was the sheer number of Soviet soldiers who would be caught in their advancing net. Intelligence estimates had predicted they would face about 200 Soviet divisions along the entire front. By the second day, it was becoming clear that Soviet strength had been seriously underestimated. The problem was not just military, but logistical. German forces were capturing prisoners faster than they could process them. Temporary prisoner of war camps hastily established in captured towns and villages were quickly overwhelmed. Within days, some camps held 50,000 prisoners in areas designed for a few hundred. The German military had made no provision for feeding and housing the massive number of prisoners they were taking. Nazi ideology classified Soviet prisoners as subhuman and undeserving of the protections of international law. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe that would ultimately claim the lives of over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. Stalin's paralysis. In Moscow, Stalin remained largely paralyzed by the scale of the disaster. Reports reaching the Kremlin painted an increasingly dire picture. The Western Front had effectively collapsed, Minsk was threatened, and German forces were advancing towards Smolensk and Moscow itself. For a man accustomed to controlling every detail of Soviet life, the reality of military defeat was almost impossible to comprehend. The Soviet dictator's first response was characteristic: more executions. General Pavlov was recalled to Moscow and shot, along with his chief of staff and several other commanders. This reign of terror actually worsened the military situation by making surviving commanders even more afraid to take initiative or report accurate information. Stalin's paranoia reached new heights as he became convinced that the military disaster was the result of treachery rather than German superiority. NKVD security forces were unleashed to hunt for traitors and saboteurs in the rear areas, creating additional chaos and fear among Soviet forces already struggling to cope with the German onslaught. The technology gap. The second day of fighting revealed the enormous technological and tactical superiority of German forces. German combined arms tactics, coordinating tanks, infantry, artillery and aircraft in mutually supporting roles, proved devastatingly effective against Soviet forces trained in outdated World War I concepts. German communication systems, based on radio rather than telephone lines, proved far more flexible and reliable than Soviet equivalents. German commanders could coordinate complex operations across hundreds of kilometers, while Soviet forces were often reduced to sending messengers on foot or horseback. However, the first encounters with modern Soviet equipment also revealed problems for German forces. The few T-34 tanks that managed to engage German armour proved nearly invulnerable to standard German anti-tank guns. German tank crews reported in alarm that their shells simply bounced off the sloped armour of the Soviet tanks. The civilians pay. Behind the advancing German armies came the Einsatzgruppen, SS units tasked with implementing Nazi racial policies in occupied territory. Within 48 hours of the invasion, mass executions of Jews, communist officials and intellectuals had begun across the occupied territories. The civilian population found itself caught between the collapsing Soviet forces and the advancing Germans. In many areas, Soviet troops fleeing eastward engaged in scorched earth tactics, destroying bridges, fuel depots, and food supplies to deny them to the enemy. This left civilian populations without resources and vulnerable to German reprisals. German forces, indoctrinated with Nazi racial theories, showed little concern for civilian casualties. Artillery and air attacks targeted cities and towns without regard for non-combatants. The rules of war, already weakened by Nazi ideology, were completely abandoned in what Hitler had declared a war of racial extermination. The trap closes. By the end of the second day, the great encirclement battle east of Minsk was taking shape. German panzer spearheads from north and south were less than 100 kilometers apart, with hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops caught between them. The Western Front, which had begun the war with nearly 700,000 men, was on the verge of complete destruction. Soviet attempts to break out of the developing encirclement were frustrated by German air power and the collapse of command and control systems. Individual units and small groups of soldiers tried desperately to escape eastward, but most were caught by German armor or aircraft. The roads leading east from Minsk became killing fields littered with destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment. German commanders were already looking beyond the immediate battle to the next phase of operations. With the Western Front destroyed, the road to Moscow would lie open. Preliminary orders were issued for the advance beyond Smolensk toward the Soviet capital. The war, which Hitler had predicted would last only a few months, seemed to be proceeding exactly according to plan. But even in the euphoria of victory, some German officers noted troubling signs. The vast distances of Russia were already straining German supply lines, and mechanical breakdowns were increasing as tanks and vehicles operated far beyond their designed limits. Most ominously, despite the collapse of organized resistance, individual Soviet soldiers continued to fight with a determination that surpassed anything the Germans had encountered in Western Europe. 72 hours after the first German artillery shell screamed across the Bug River, the world had irrevocably changed. By dawn on June 25, 1941, German forces had advanced up to 200 kilometers into Soviet territory, destroyed over 2,000 Soviet aircraft, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and effectively eliminated 3 entire Soviet armies. The speed and completeness of German victory exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. General Halder confided to his diary, "It is probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks." The German High Command was already beginning to plan for the post-war division of Soviet territory and the deployment of forces to other theatres. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, the seeds of ultimate disaster were already visible to those with eyes to see. The vast distances that had seemed manageable on maps were proving exhausting in reality. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of primitive roads were beginning to break down. Most ominously, while organized Soviet resistance had collapsed, the fighting spirit of individual Soviet soldiers remained unbroken. The Minsk Cauldron. The crowning achievement of these first 72 hours was the successful completion of the first great encirclement battle of the Eastern Front. On June 25th, advance elements of Guderian's Panzer Group II and Hoth's Panzer Group III linked up east of Minsk, trapping an estimated 400,000 Soviet soldiers in a massive cauldron. The scene inside the encirclement was apocalyptic. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, cut off from supplies and command, wandered through forests and swamps in desperate attempts to escape. German aircraft strafed refugee columns continuously, while artillery pounded any concentration of troops. The few Soviet attempts to break out were crushed by German armour and infantry. General Ivan Boldin, trapped with his men inside the cauldron, later wrote, "The forest was full of wandering soldiers, many wounded, all hungry and exhausted. Officers had lost contact with their units. We could hear German voices getting closer each day. It was clear that organised resistance was impossible. All we could do was try to save as many men as possible by breaking out in small groups." The German Second Army, following behind the Panzer spearheads, was tasked with destroying the trapped Soviet forces. What followed was not so much a battle as a massacre. Soviet soldiers, without air cover, adequate ammunition, or communication with higher headquarters, were systematically hunted down and destroyed. By July 9th, when organised resistance finally ended, the Germans claimed to have captured 324,000 prisoners and killed an estimated 100,000 more. Stalin's awakening. The scale of the disaster finally penetrated Stalin's wall of denial. On June 25th, the Soviet dictator emerged from his dacha where he had retreated after the initial shock of invasion. The man who returned to the Kremlin was changed. Gone was the confident master of the Soviet Union, replaced by a leader who finally understood the mortal threat facing his regime. Stalin's first major decision was to establish the State Defense Committee, GKO, a super cabinet that would coordinate all aspects of the Soviet war effort. More importantly, he began to listen to his military advisors, particularly General Georgy Zhukov, who had been urging a more realistic approach to the military situation. But Stalin's awakening came at a terrible cost. 3 Soviet armies, the 3rd, 10th and 13th, had been effectively destroyed in just 72 hours. The Western Front, which had been the strongest of the Soviet frontier forces, existed only on paper. The road to Moscow lay open, and German panzer spearheads were already racing towards Smolensk. The price of purges. The first 72 hours of Barbarossa starkly revealed the price Stalin had paid for his paranoid purges of the Red Army leadership. The Soviet military, deprived of experienced commanders and paralysed by fear of the NKVD, had proven incapable of responding effectively to German attack. General Pavlov, the unfortunate commander of the Western Front, was recalled to Moscow on June 25th and shot 4 days later. His chief of staff, communications chief and artillery commander shared his fate. This reign of terror, rather than inspiring better performance, only increased the paralysis of surviving commanders. The contrast with German leadership was stark. German commanders like Guderian and Hoth were encouraged to show initiative and take risks. When radio communications failed, they personally moved forward to maintain contact with their spearheads. Soviet commanders, terrified of being accused of unauthorized actions, often preferred to do nothing rather than risk Stalin's wrath. The technological revelation. The first major tank battles of the Eastern Front, fought during these crucial 72 hours, revealed a disturbing reality to German commanders. While German tactics and training remained superior, Soviet equipment was often better than anything in the German arsenal. The T-34 tank, in particular, came as a shock to German tank crews. Major General Willibald Freiherr von Langemann, commanding the 4th Panzer Division, reported in alarm. "Our anti-tank guns are useless against the new Russian tanks. Their shells simply bounce off. We need new weapons urgently, or we will lose our advantage in armoured warfare." This would prove to be a prophetic warning. The few KV-1 heavy tanks encountered by German forces proved even more formidable. One famous incident saw a single KV-1 block a German supply route for days, immune to all German anti-tank weapons. Only a direct hit from an 88mm anti-aircraft gun finally destroyed it. German officers began to realize that their technological superiority was not as great as they had assumed. The logistics nightmare begins. Perhaps most ominously for German prospects, the first 72 hours revealed the enormous logistical challenges of operating in the Soviet Union. The primitive road network, designed for horse-drawn traffic, quickly broke down under the weight of German mechanized divisions. Vehicles designed for Western European roads began to suffer mechanical failures at alarming rates. Fuel consumption exceeded all projections as tanks and vehicles operated cross-country and at high speeds for extended periods. Ammunition expenditure was higher than expected due to the intensity of fighting and the need to destroy enormous quantities of abandoned Soviet equipment. Most critically, the German supply system, designed for the shorter campaigns in Western Europe, was already showing signs of strain. General Eduard Wagner, the German army's chief quartermaster, wrote prophetically, "The distances here are unlike anything we have experienced. Our supply columns are stretched across hundreds of kilometers of poor roads. If the Russians can organize effective resistance once they recover from the initial shock, our logistics will become a critical vulnerability." The Soviet Phoenix. Yet even as German forces celebrated their victories, the Soviet Union was beginning to demonstrate the resilience that would ultimately doom the German invasion. In the depths of the Soviet interior, beyond the reach of German armor, massive mobilization efforts were underway. Factories in the Urals and Siberia, safe from German attack, began converting to military production on a scale that dwarfed German industry. Millions of Soviet citizens, galvanized by the German invasion and the obvious,